Meet the Sound. It's a good song. We love it. It's an old song. Amazing about grace. That's a question that I'd like for us to deal with for a few minutes this morning. What's so amazing about grace? We've been talking about, long story short, and we're nearing the end of that. But I don't know that we can tell the whole story of the Bible and condense it down into manageable portions without talking a little bit about this idea of grace. And for some reason, I've never really understood this, but for some reason, grace becomes a controversial topic at times. I don't hear it so much now, but I don't know, 20 years or so ago, and I was going through school and thinking about being a preacher and all this stuff, there was this whole, like a fight between churches that called themselves grace-centered and churches that really said, no, we believe in works. And so I remember very clearly this whole divide, it seemed, about churches or Christians who wanted to say, we really believe in grace. And then another side said, we really believe in works. And I'm thinking, man, this sounds like a really dumb discussion to me, because don't they all matter? Isn't all this kind of important? Grace is important, and faith is important, and works are important. And so why do we sit around and fight about all this stuff? And I think maybe it comes from not thinking about grace enough, or not thinking about what grace really is. Is it amazing, or is it not? And if it is amazing, then what in the world makes grace amazing? That's kind of the topic that we're going to talk about today. Now, obviously, we're going to center this thing on Jesus because we've made it to the New Testament portion of this series. But we cannot get to the New Testament's writings and thoughts about grace without starting where all of them would have started, and that would have been in the Old Testament. So for just a few minutes, like what Andrew read for us just a few minutes ago, I want us to go back to the book of Genesis, because there are some really, really important topics about grace in the book of Genesis, although you don't always read the word. You may read the word favor in the Old Testament. That's kind of the same word. Or you may read a word like loving kindness. It's kind of the same word. Those eventually become the basis of what we call in the New Testament grace. But we're going to get to that. We'll cross that bridge whenever we get there. All the way back to Genesis chapter 12 is where I'd like for you to start, because there's this great backdrop of grace that defines pretty much all of the Old Testament. Now, I know if you're hearing that for the first time, you may be thinking, well, I thought that the God of the Old Testament was very wrathful and mean and angry, and the God of the New Testament is the God of grace and love and mercy. Well, no, they're the same God, and that God doesn't change. And so if you're looking, you may not read the word, but you'll find grace as kind of a backdrop of this whole Old Testament. For instance, in Genesis chapter 12, we meet a man named Abram. And up until this point, there is absolutely nothing special about the man named Abram. His name's going to become Abraham. That's how we typically know him. And so if it's okay with you, that's how I'm going to refer to him. He's Abraham. We meet Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. He's a nomad. He has moved from Canaan up through Mesopotamia, what we would call today, I think, the Fertile Crescent. And so he's kind of come through that whole thing up to the north and is going to be coming back down south. You don't read anything special about Abraham before God calls him in Genesis chapter 12. And in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, he gives him great promises. All right, I'm going to make your name great, going to bless you. You're going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. All of this thing's going to run through you and your family, Abraham. God's great rescue plan for the entire planet goes through him. And it's great. It's a great story. But Abraham's done nothing up until this point. He's a nomad. In fact, some later biblical writings will talk about how Abraham's family were probably polytheistic. He's not even sure about this God that has now called him. But this God calls him and says, got these promises for you. Now you need to leave your father's house, your family, your kindred, and go to a land that I will show you, and I will bless you and do all these great things. And Abraham goes. But along the way, things go south. Along the way, Abraham starts to figure God made these promises, but I don't have anything. And that's where Andrew read in Genesis chapter 15, where Abraham says, you promised me this thing, and I don't have an heir. I don't have the person that you promised. God takes him outside and makes the promise again and says, Abraham, I want you to know that you look up at all the stars, and you're going to have descendants that are more numerous than that. It's incredible, an incredible promise of what God is going to do for Abraham. And at that point, Abraham believes that, and it is counted as righteousness. That's the quote that Paul's going to use in Romans when he refers back to Abraham. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. It's pure, simple belief that Abraham has in what God has promised him. That quote comes right from Genesis chapter 15. And at this point, the only thing that has happened is that God has initiated grace, goodness, generosity to Abraham absolutely unilaterally. Not that Abraham was deserving. It's not that Abraham was so worthy of this. He did not merit God choosing him. All he did is wander around and accept what God had asked him to do or told him to do. God acted unilaterally, unexpectedly, and very generously towards Abraham before he met any prerequisites. We're going to come back to that, but I want you to see that. Now, you may think, well, Abraham was circumcised, and he's the father of the Jews, and he gave them the rite of circumcision. True, but that doesn't come until Genesis 17. The promise comes in 12. The promise is remembered in 15, and circumcision comes in chapter 17. And so Abraham experiences this great grace of God before he does anything, or without doing anything worthy of meriting that kind of favor, gift, generosity, or goodness. That's Abraham. Major character that everybody who first read the New Testament would have known is Abraham. Well, probably right behind him is a guy named Moses. Now, we know Moses. We know the names. Charlton Heston, right? We know Moses. But Moses isn't always the great hero of the story. In fact, if you read the first few chapters in Exodus, it's like a villain. He's a guy who's killing somebody, and then he has to go on the run. And so for the first 40 years or so of his life, Moses is raised as an Egyptian with their customs and their language. And then he's spending 40 years, his next 40 years are out in the wilderness, in the fields and the pastures as a shepherd. And so Israel, at this point, has been enslaved by Egypt for about 400 years. And you got 80-year-old Moses, who's just a shepherd out in the field. We don't read about any merit. You don't read about anything Moses does to deserve what God is going to call him to do. But there's a burning bush, and Moses is curious, and so he turns aside to see what's going on with the bush that is burning but is not consumed. Take off your sandals, for the feet or your place where you're standing is holy ground. Again, God unilaterally acts to save the people while they are unable to do anything. And he acts by calling Moses and equipping Moses and his brother Aaron to go over into Egypt and to rescue this group of people who've been enslaved for 400 years. And so they go and they tell Pharaoh and they tell the people, let my people go, let's go out and worship God. God equips them with the 10 plagues. They come out, they cross the Red Sea. God provides for them food and water in the wilderness. He brings them to Mount Sinai, and they have this great song of celebration. And the song of celebration in Exodus 15 is not, look at how powerful we are, look at how great we are, and how much good we have done. It's, in the words of Exodus 15, verse 13, in your unfailing love, a word that's tied very closely to grace, you will lead the people that you have redeemed. Out of your love, you lead the people whom you have redeemed. Not out of our goodness, not out of our strength or power or might, not anything like that. It's out of your great love, out of your grace, you lead the people that you redeemed. Well, they had the law, right? Of course they had the law. But the law doesn't come till Exodus 20. That's the 10 Commandments. The redemption, an act of grace, comes in Exodus chapters 1 through 15 or so. The law was a response to God's grace, not a requirement at that point to receive it. And so people would have questions, and I hope at this point you've got questions. Some of this can be a bit confusing, and I hope you got questions. They would have had questions, but God provides them an answer for their questions. I'd like to read that passage on the screen together. It's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 20 through 24. It's pretty short. It won't take us a whole lot of time. But it's in the setting of a family, and you know, in Deuteronomy 6, there's this whole passage about, talk about God and about who God is and what God has done. Talk about these things. When you sit down, when you rise up, when you lay down, when you're having meals together, talk about the goodness of God and what he's done for you. And if you have problems describing it, Moses gives them a remedy. Verse 20, when your son asks you in time to come, what's the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Okay, good question. What's the meaning of the law? Why, in other words, do we live like we live? Why do we abstain from things that everybody else abstains from? That's the question that would have come up from a son raised in this kind of home. Why can all my friends go do that, but I can't? Why do they eat like they eat and we have dietary laws? Why are they able to go and do whatever they want to do on Saturday, but we abide by the Sabbath day restrictions? Why do we do that? What is the meaning of all these things? What's the meaning of the law? What's wrong with the adultery and the murder and the coveting, and why do we honor father and mother? And what's this business about have no other gods before me and no grave? Why? What's the meaning of all these statutes and these rules and these laws that the Lord has commanded us? Verse 21, good question. You shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and Pharaoh and his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there that he may bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, and for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day. Let's go to verse 25. And it will be righteous for us if we're careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God as he has commanded us. Now, let me ask you a question. Son says, what's the meaning of all these rules and laws and statutes and commandments that the Lord places upon us? Why must we do all these things? Could the father have said, well, because the Lord said so. That's why we do these things. Could he have said that? Yes, absolutely. Would that have been an accurate statement? Because the Lord said so, because God said so. Yes, that would have been an accurate statement. Is it a full description of why we have these rules, laws, statutes, and commandments? Then the answer is no. The full answer, Moses says, is you have to go back and tell them about the grace of God. This is how the story is passed down through the generations. When your son says, what in the world is the meaning of all these things that we have to do? You say, son, we were slaves. And we didn't have any way out of that situation but by the grace of God. We prayed about it. We cried out about it. We were oppressed. Finally, God heard our cries, and he raised up and equipped Moses and Aaron, and they go, and it was by the grace of God that we came out, and in order to preserve us alive, God gave us these laws and statutes for us to live by. And from Deuteronomy 6 onward, that is supposed to be the story that is passed down through the generations. There's a backdrop of grace even behind the commandments that God gives. His commandments that he gives us are acts of grace. They keep us. They preserve us. They protect us. Every commandment that God gives us is good for us. So, in the Old Testament, the grace and the mercy and the generosity and the charity of God comes first, and then the people are expected to act in response. That's with Abraham, that's with Moses, and that's how they are supposed to pass down this message throughout all their generations. The initiating goodness of God is common through the Old Testament. God starts it. That's grace. God initiates it. That is grace. And it forms the basis and the motive for everything that comes afterwards. So, that's their background. Abraham, Moses, pass it down through the generations. This is how God works. He delivers, and he expects a response. Then we come to Jesus. These early followers of Jesus, Old Testament is not new to them. They knew it. There's a list of verses on the screen right now. I get it. It's a lot of them. We're not going to read every one of them, but I do want you to have them because I'd like you to read them at some point. The early followers of Jesus would have known the Old Testament stories of God's grace and goodness and mercy and kindness. And so when it comes to Jesus, they were not so much learning about grace as they were being reminded that our God is a God of grace. Along the way, I think they stopped passing down the stories of God delivered us from the Egyptians and God protected us with his laws and God was gracious and then gave us a way to respond. It seems like it became at some point for many of them kind of a the-box kind of religion. And so they weren't so much learning grace, they needed to be reminded of it. And so in John 1, verse 17, grace, and truth come by Jesus. And so if we're looking for the greatest example of truth, we're looking at Jesus. He is truth, the way, the truth, and the life. And if we're looking at the best example of grace, then we also look at Jesus. And so yes, Jesus is a great example of grace. He's the greatest example of grace. And sometimes in our minds, in our world, if we talk about grace too much, then I think people get the idea that, well, nothing that I do really matters. If God is a God of grace, then what does it matter what I do? If all my sins, if that's what it's all about, if all my sins are covered, salvation is secured by the grace of God. By grace we're saved through faith, not of works, right? If that's all it is, then what does it matter what I do? Because I got my sins atoned for, they're taken care of, I'm not guilty of them anymore, Jesus is, I can go to heaven. If that's all it is, then I get it. We can't err on too much of it. But that's what grace is. Paul writes that grace teaches us how we should live. And so Jesus is both the great example of grace, but he's also someone who put a lot of emphasis on what people did with their lives. Grace is never an excuse to sit around and do nothing. Grace is never a reason to not consider what we do with our lives. For instance, Jesus says, these are his words, Matthew 7:21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of my Father who is in heaven. Now, how in the world can the greatest example of grace that the world has ever known say something like that? Because it's a faulty understanding of grace that says what I do doesn't matter. It's a healthy understanding of grace that says God has been gracious to us, and so we must act in response to that grace. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom, but those who do the will of my Father in heaven. The way that Luke has it, Luke 6:46, why do you call me Lord, but not do the things that I tell you to do? Jesus is love, Jesus is grace, but he still thinks there's something really important about what we do, not just what we believe, and not just saying the right things, but what we do. He didn't just teach it. He actually lives it out. In Mark chapter 2 on the screen, you'll find Jesus taking gracious action. People like Matthew or Levi, same guy, tax collector, universally opposed in that world. Nobody liked him. Nobody wanted him to be around. You definitely didn't go to Matthew's house to have dinner or something like that. That's where you find Jesus, though, acting graciously with people like Matthew. You find him over and over again, every time he encounters, in fact, an outsider, someone deemed unrighteous, a stranger, somebody that's overlooked, somebody nobody else wants, people who have checked no boxes, have accomplished zero of the prerequisites that most would have assumed needed to be checked before you came to God. Jesus welcomes those people. He didn't just talk about grace. He showed the world what grace looks like. And if we didn't get the picture, and if they didn't get the picture, he shows us with stories what it is. In Luke 14, he talks about this great parable of the great banquet. You spent a lot of money on the steaks. You spent a lot of money on the decorations. You spent a lot of money on making sure everything is prim and proper and exactly how it should be. Who are you going to invite? Of course, you're going to invite the people who can afford the steaks next weekend when it's their turn to invite you. You're going to invite the people who can afford to repay you for what you've done and how you've treated them, right? Jesus says, no, that's not grace. That's earning your meal at their house next weekend. He said, when you throw this great banquet feast, no, don't do that. You go out and you invite the poor and the lame and the blind. You go out and invite the ones who cannot any way repay you. You do good things, generous things, gracious things for others, expecting nothing in return. Who lives like that? Jesus does. He told stories about it. There's a brother in Luke 15 who goes to the dad and says, I want my stuff. I want my inheritance right here, right now. I'm going to go do it. And the father divides his inheritance to the younger son. And the younger son takes it and he goes to a far country. That's the unrighteous area. That's where people don't do right. That's where people make a lot of mistakes. That's where people often don't come back from. And he goes and he wastes his inheritance on riotous, prodigal living, reckless life. Then he comes to himself and he says, I need food, I got to go back home. And he goes back home, and the father rushes out before the boy offers to his father one word about, I'm going to do better. He's got it worked up in his mind, but he doesn't say anything. The father welcomes him with a hug, a kiss on his neck, a robe, sandals, a ring, and a fatted calf. The kid couldn't do anything to repay his father. He'd wasted all his money. He had nothing. This is an act of grace. Those are so familiar to us. We know that's how God acts. We know in the great banquet you invite the ones who can't repay you because that's grace, and you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the just, Luke 14, verse 14. We know those stories. We know the prodigal is welcomed back home, and the older brother who did everything right is the one who ends that story outside the father's banquet. It's a tough story, but we know it. My guess, in our world, in our daily lives, the one that doesn't sit very well with us is Matthew 20. Have you read that lately? If you have, my guess is you didn't like it a whole lot. Because in Matthew 20, there's a guy, it's a parable, there's a guy who's trying to hire some workers for the day for out in his fields. And people show up at 6 a.m. at daylight. And they say, we'll work for you. We'll give you a day's wage, a denarius, a day's wage. Great, I'll work all day. I need it. Got to feed my family. Got to put food on the table and shoes on the baby's feet. And I got problems, and here we go. I'm going to work all day. And some folks, they show up at 10 o'clock. And they're going to work not quite as long, 4 hours or so less than the guy that showed up at 6. But they get paid a day's wage too. And there's some folks who show up a little after lunch. They slept in. And they show up to work. They're going to get the same pay. There's some folks who show up about an hour before quitting time. And you know what they get paid? What would you pay them? I wouldn't want to pay them the whole thing. That's what they get. And then there's this verse in Matthew 20 when everybody's upset about it. Nobody likes it because they fair. And it didn't just sit right. Matthew 20:15, do you really think I'm evil because I do good? And probably the human answer to that is yes. Yeah, because the guy that showed up at 6 worked 12 times harder, 12 times as long as the guy that showed up at 5 p.m. And they got paid the same. Doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem fair. It's not fair. It's grace. And everybody went home that day with what they needed. That's grace. And I think maybe that's why grace can become so controversial. Because it doesn't seem right, maybe to us. When people don't get what they deserve, it doesn't seem right to us. But that's the Christianity that we believe. That we don't get what we deserve. And thank God for that. The life of Jesus is about showing grace and love and generosity to those who are deemed unworthy, not good enough, unable to reciprocate what's been given to them. And that kind of thinking took off. People heard these stories about Jesus. They heard about, the great banquet feast where the wrong people are invited. They heard about the prodigal son being able to come back home. They heard about the guy who didn't work as much as everybody else, but he still got what he needed in Christ. They heard about those things, and that gracious concept took off. And so when you read about the early church, we're not going to read all these, but I'll put them on the board so you can see them. There's grace. When they talked about it in Acts chapter 4, verse 33, they talked about how God's grace was powerfully at work. They took hold of that word, charis, gift, generous, and they used it. Talked about the grace of God is at work. In Acts 6, verse 8, the early church leaders were full of grace and power. They were taking care of people. They took the model of Jesus and applied it to their lives. In Acts 11:23, when good things were happening, they viewed it as the grace of God, what the grace of God has done. In Acts 14, verse 3, early church would carry around a message of grace, of great grace, and that message really, really took off. We'll come back to that in just a second because it really landed some of them in trouble. But eventually you come to Acts 20, verse 4, and when Paul's message is summarized, it's basically summarized as the good news of God's grace. Early church took hold of it, loved it, lived it out. And so grace is not something that the earliest Christians sat around and thanked God for. They probably did, but it's not all they did. It was at the core of what they believed about God, and it was at the core of what they believed that their lives should look like. As we round this out, I want you to think about Paul for just a second. Skilled theologian. Paul was a scholar in Scripture, but he was also very anti-Christian when we meet him. He's trying to kill us. He's trying to throw Christians in jail. He's opposing God and the grace of God and the efforts of God. He's opposed to everything that God is doing. And you know, Paul should have, if he's going to get what he deserves, if he's going to get what's fair, and you got all these Christians out here who are suffering because they're trying to follow Jesus, and it's Paul who's trying to put them in jail and trying to kill them and consenting to their death. The Christians aren't getting what they deserve, and if Paul gets what he deserves, it's not good. But in Acts 9, Paul meets the Lord, he does not get what he deserves. He should have been judged for that, but he wasn't. And that may be the key to grace. That Paul doesn't get the severity of God, which he may have deserved. Paul gets the goodness of God. Now, how would your life change if you were the one, and I know it's hard, we've heard this, it's hard to put ourselves in Paul's shoes as one who hates Jesus and hates Christians and hates them enough that he wants to kill them, and then he has shown grace by this very person that he's persecuting, and he's welcomed in gracefully among the believers in Christ, and he is welcomed by everybody eventually. How would your life change? How would that change your view of grace and of how people should treat other people and how relationships ought to work? The first stage of Paul's life is over on the Damascus Road, and his second stage of life begins with the experience of God's grace, of recognizing that God's not who he thought he was. And that experience of God's grace sustains him through the rest of his life. It informs his ideas about the world and about God and about the church and about what his life ought to be like. And so there's a problem when Paul is really hitting his stride in ministry. I told you the grace of God is going out and they are welcoming. The grace of God is powerful and people are becoming Christians like crazy. The church is multiplying like crazy. It's great. He encounters a huge problem. May not be to us, but it is to them. If you got a Bible, Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Huge controversy that would not really be controversial, I think, to us in our church today. We have different controversies. This is theirs. Paul comes back to Jerusalem. He's been gone for a few years, about 14, I believe. And he comes back to Jerusalem, and things have changed. He's got a man named Titus with him. And Titus is a fellow worker of Paul, but he's not Jewish. And so, you know, circumcision commanded, 8th day for those who descend out of Abraham, all the Jews. Titus is not that guy. He's a grown-up. Been converted to the faith. Not Jewish. And when they hear about Titus, the Gentile showing up, probably a Greek guy, a lot of the Jews say, well, we got to circumcise that guy. That's the law of God. That puts us into a covenant relationship with God. And so if we're going to support him in his work with Paul, we got to circumcise him. He's got to go through the rules, statutes, and the commandments. And Paul is completely against it. The Pharisee, Paul, is completely against it. Scholar in the law, expert in the scriptures, completely against it because it contradicts Paul's view of God and his grace. It's not that Paul didn't know the Old Testament. It's not that Paul didn't know about circumcision. It's that Paul knew that the grace of God was deeply rooted in the Old Testament. But these Jews were not offering that grace to those Gentiles. This is a small picture of a huge problem in the first century church. Do people need to obey the law of Moses in order to receive the grace of God? In Galatians 3, verse 1, Paul's got very strong language. Very strong, not as strong as the language in chapter 5, but pretty strong when he says, oh, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Who has pulled the wool over your eyes thinking that God is not a God of grace, has to go through all these rules and all these restrictions. It's a divisive statement. At this point, Barnabas, the great encourager, is scared. At this point, Peter, the mouthpiece of the church early on, Peter has flip-flopped and changed his view and has decided, I don't know. I don't know if I can be around those dirty Gentiles. That's Peter at this point. So Barnabas is afraid, and Peter's a little wishy-washy, and Paul is absolutely enraged. So much so that he says in Galatians 5:12, if y'all going to insist on circumcision, I wish you'd go ahead and emasculate yourselves. Don't stop there. It's a huge problem. And it's not about law of Moses. It's not about circumcision. It's not about Titus. It's about what do we believe about the grace of God. So there's a council. Acts 15 is the council. There's a great church meeting where they all come together. Hey, Paul's around here and he's converting these folks to Christianity, and they're not Jewish. And so they don't observe the dietary laws, and they don't observe the Sabbath, and they don't observe all the rules and commandments, and they hadn't been circumcised. And what in the world are we going to do about this? We got problems. Grace of God has gone out. The message of God has been way too successful. Church is growing. People coming to Jesus. And some hate it because they didn't check the circumcision box just yet. I would say that Acts 15, 13 through 21 may be the most important speech in the entire book of Acts. And so we're going to read it together. That's the problem. That's the setting. And here's how they decide to handle it. Acts 15, verse 12. All the assembly fell silent, and they listened to Barnabas and Paul as they related what God had done through them among the Gentiles, the ones who didn't accomplish the prereqs. And after they finished speaking, James replied, brothers, listen to me. James is, when he speaks, people listen. Simeon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written. After this I will return, I'll rebuild the tent of David that is fallen. I will rebuild its ruins, I'll restore it, that the remnant of mankind may seek the Lord. All the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from of old. Therefore, he says, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain. And these are things that are just common objections, things that would have been commonly objected throughout all of the Jews. Abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moses has had in every synagogue those who proclaim him, for he has read every Sabbath in the synagogues. James says, you know what? God's plan for the Gentiles includes grace, not the law of Moses. And if you read through the rest of the book of Acts, after that announcement, the multi-ethnic, multicultural church filled with Jews and Gentiles rejoiced. Paul and Barnabas are inspired to launch out into another missionary journey, and it's all by the grace of God. And so I want to end where I started. What is so amazing about grace? We just took a whirlwind tour from Genesis 12 through the modern day church. What is so amazing about grace? I think it's deeper than our sins are forgiven. I think it's deeper than we can go to heaven. It seems to me that grace teaches us about how we should live here and now. Paul takes his word of God seriously. He always has. For him, grace and faith and obedient action are all hallmarks of Christianity. Obedience is a hallmark of Christianity. It's a hallmark of a response of God's grace. It's not a prerequisite for the grace of God, because if grace is earned, then it's really not grace. The guy that showed up near quitting time in Matthew 20 didn't really earn his wages that day. It was grace. The son who shows up after the older brother has stayed there his entire life did not really earn his grace. The poor and the lame and the blind, ones who cannot receive the favor, did not earn their invitation to the great wedding banquet. That was an act of grace. If it's earned, then it's not grace. Now, this grace has shown up in Jesus, and Scripture reminds us so often that God has been working behind the scenes on our behalf throughout history, with Abraham and with Moses, and God's grace is most clearly seen in Jesus, the one who was sent to us while we were yet sinners. And so what is so amazing about grace? Let me leave you with two things maybe. Maybe that grace is freely offered to us, most clearly seen in Jesus. And in Paul's language, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, for the ungodly, for enemies of God, that we can be the righteousness of God. And so there's something sacrificial in the grace coming through Jesus. Something atoning in that, where we can be right with God, at one with God. So maybe the grace that you need this morning is that kind of grace. Not a cheap grace where, I'm forgiven for my sins and then don't worry about anything else until I die and go to heaven. That's cheap grace. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a costly grace, but a grace that comes in Jesus through the cross, and that is received in baptism as we unite with that death and come out on the other side resurrected, ready to live a new kind of life. That's the grace of God that offers that kind of life, of faithful obedience to what Jesus wants us to do, because not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of the Father in heaven. But what is that will of the Father? The second part would be that grace is clearly seen in Jesus, and that gives us a model to live out in our lives. This is Paul's language from Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, where he said, the grace of God has appeared in the form of Jesus Christ, and it teaches us to deny ungodliness. That's what grace does. It doesn't just save us from ungodliness, it teaches us to deny ungodliness and to deny worldly passions and to be self-controlled and live lives that are upright and godly. And so that's what grace does. It's most clearly seen in Jesus. It offers us healing from our sins, and it offers us an example of how we should then live. Clearly seen in Jesus. And the grace that is seen in Jesus teaches us to deny ungodliness and worldly passions and to live a life that follows the steps of Jesus. What's that mean for you? It means that when you hear messages like this, there should be some kind of response in your life. It should be some kind of response in what you think. There should be some kind of response in how you live. When you hear a message on grace, it should not be just comforting for your eternal salvation. It should be confrontational for how you deal with people and how you think about people and how you talk to people and how you respond to people and your general thoughts about what you do every day of your life. So what's so amazing about grace? I think there's a lot. But if you pin me down on it, I think grace shows us the love of God in Christ Jesus and shows us how we are to live that out in our world. Most clearly seen in Jesus. And so this morning, I'm not sure where that finds you, but you may very well be here in need of that first part of grace we talked about, that we find in giving our lives over to God, in trusting Him with our lives, with everything that we are. We find that as we come to be baptized in water, to have our sins washed away, to put off the old, and to begin living a new kind of life. And so maybe that's your need this morning. Or maybe it's to think more graciously in your life, in your dealings with people, your family, your coworkers, the people you see at school. The grace of God teaches us to deny certain things so that we can live in certain ways. And this morning, if you have